The autumn wind swept through downtown Chicago, carrying with it the familiar scent of roasted coffee and ambition that Marcus Williams had grown accustomed to over the past 3 years. At 28, he walked through the glass doors of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions with the confidence of someone who believed he had finally made it. His tailored navy suit, perfectly knotted tie, and leather briefcase weren't just accessories, they were symbols of his carefully constructed identity. "Morning, Marcus," called out Janet from reception, her warm smile a daily reminder of how well he fit into this polished corporate world. He returned the greeting with his practiced professional charm, the kind that had helped him climb from junior associate to senior account manager faster than anyone in the company's recent history. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt routine, almost meditative. Marcus watched the city shrink below him through the glass walls, feeling like he was literally rising above his past. Gone were the days of his cramped studio apartment in Pilsen, where he'd eaten ramen noodles for dinner while studying for his business degree at DePaul University. Gone were the nights when he'd wondered if his dreams of success were just elaborate fantasies. His corner office overlooked Michigan Avenue, and every morning he took a moment to appreciate the view. The bustling streets below reminded him of how far he'd traveled from his childhood in a working-class neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, where his mother had worked double shifts as a nurse just to keep their small family afloat. "Marcus, you ready for the big presentation?" The voice belonged to Sarah Chen, his closest colleague and, if he was honest with himself, something more than just a work friend. She stood in his doorway, her black hair falling perfectly around her shoulders, holding 2 cups of coffee from the expensive cafe downstairs. "Born ready," he replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. 3 months of preparation, and today, we finally pitched a Richardson account. The Richardson Group represented the kind of client that could make careers. A multi-million-dollar retail chain looking to rebrand their entire marketing strategy. They were exactly the type of account that separated the rising stars from the rest of the pack. Marcus had poured his heart into the presentation, working late nights and early mornings to craft what he believed was a revolutionary approach to their marketing challenges. "I've been thinking about this campaign since we first heard about the opportunity," Marcus continued, settling into his chair as Sarah perched on the edge of his desk. "You know what the best part is? This isn't just about landing a big client. This is about proving that creativity and hard work can compete with connections and legacy." Sarah smiled, but Marcus caught something in her expression, a flicker of concern that she quickly masked. "What do you mean by that?" "Come on, Sarah. We both know how this industry works. Half the major accounts go to firms because of who their partners went to college with or whose family they've known for decades. But this is merit-based, pure and simple." The morning passed in a blur of final preparations. Marcus reviewed his slides for the 100th time, practicing his delivery in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie, and running through potential questions the clients might ask. His confidence was unshakable, the presentation was flawless, his research impeccable, and his creative vision exactly what Richardson Group needed. At 11:30 a.m., Marcus gathered his materials and headed toward Conference Room A, the company's most impressive meeting space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, and the polished mahogany table could seat 20 people comfortably. As he walked through the hallway, he noticed several colleagues watching him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Some seemed supportive, others appeared almost sympathetic, which struck him as odd since he was about to deliver what he was certain would be the presentation of his career. "Marcus, wait up." He turned to see David Foster, the company's VP of Client Relations, approaching with an expression that made Marcus's stomach tighten slightly. "Is everything okay, David? The clients should be here any minute." David's pause lasted just a beat too long. "That's what I need to talk to you about. There's been a change of plans." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "What kind of change?" "The partners have decided to go in a different direction with the Richardson presentation. We're having James Patterson take the lead instead." Marcus felt the world shift beneath his feet. James Patterson was a decent account manager, but he'd been with the company for less than a year and had never handled anything close to the scope of the Richardson account. More importantly, James hadn't spent 3 months developing the strategy that Marcus had crafted from scratch. "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. "This is my account. I've been working on this presentation since July. The research, the creative strategy, the market analysis, everything came from my team. I know this is difficult, Marcus, but the decision has been made. The partners feel that James's approach might be a better fit for what Richardson is looking for." James's approach. Marcus couldn't hide his confusion. What approach? He wasn't even assigned to this account until today. David's discomfort was obvious now. "Look, Marcus, these decisions happen for a lot of different reasons. It's not a reflection on your abilities or your work ethic. Sometimes it's just about fit." The word hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Fit. Marcus had heard that word before, usually in contexts that had nothing to do with professional qualifications and everything to do with who belonged and who didn't. "Can I at least speak with Mr. Richardson directly? Present my strategy alongside James's so the client can make an informed decision?" "That's not going to be possible. The meeting starts in 10 minutes, and the client is expecting to work with James." As if summoned by their conversation, James Patterson appeared in the hallway, carrying a presentation folder and looking every bit as confident as Marcus had felt just minutes earlier. He was tall, blonde, and possessed a kind of easy charm that came naturally to people who had never doubted their place in the world. "Hey Marcus, I wanted to thank you for all the preliminary work you did on Richardson. Really solid foundation stuff. I'll make sure to mention your contributions if it comes up." The casual condescension in James's tone was unmistakable. Marcus watched as James walked into his conference room for his presentation with his 3 months of work and felt something fundamental shift inside him. Sarah appeared at his side, her hand gently touching his arm. "Marcus, I'm so sorry. I had no idea this was going to happen. Did you know about this beforehand?" he asked, studying her face. Her hesitation was answer enough. "I heard rumors yesterday afternoon, but I hope they weren't true. I should have warned you." Marcus walked back to his office in a daze, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Through his window, he could see into conference room A, where James was already charming the Richardson Group executives with what Marcus assumed was a watered-down version of his own strategy. The rest of the day passed like a nightmare. Marcus tried to focus on other projects, but his concentration was shattered. Colleagues avoided eye contact, and the few who did speak to him offered the kind of awkward condolences typically reserved for funerals. By p.m., he learned that James had successfully landed the Richardson account, sealing the deal with what the partners praised as exactly the kind of innovative thinking our clients expect from Pinnacle. As the sun began to set over Chicago, Marcus sat in his office staring at his computer screen, unable to focus on anything productive. The view that had once inspired him now felt like a mockery, a reminder of how quickly success could be stripped away without warning or explanation. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Want to grab dinner and talk about this?" Marcus stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Rain check. I need some time to think." That evening, Marcus walked home through the streets of Chicago, his mind replaying every moment of the day. The confident man who had entered Pinnacle Marketing Solutions that morning felt like a stranger, someone naive and foolishly trusting who had believed that merit alone would be enough to succeed. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, not just in his career, but in his understanding of how the world actually worked. The exclusion from the Richardson presentation wasn't just a professional setback, it was a revelation about the limits of his carefully constructed identity. He didn't know it yet, but this day would mark the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of something entirely different. The perfect life he had built was starting to crack, and through those cracks, he would eventually discover truths about himself, about success, and about resilience that would change everything. 3 weeks had passed since the Richardson incident, and Marcus found himself caught in a strange limbo. Officially, nothing at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions had changed. He still had his corner office, his impressive title, and his 6-figure salary. But everything felt different. as if he was acting in a play where everyone else had been given a new script except him. The Chicago morning was unusually warm for late October, and Marcus sat in his office reviewing quarterly reports that felt increasingly meaningless. Through his window, he watched construction workers breaking ground on a new building across the street. Their work was straightforward: dig, build, create something tangible. Marcus envied their clarity of purpose. "Marcus, can I see you in my office?" The request came from Patricia Holmes, Pinnacle's managing partner. She was a woman in her early 50s who had built her career in advertising during an era when women had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition. Marcus had always respected her directness and assumed she respected his work ethic. Her office was a testament to decades of success, awards lining the walls, photos with celebrities and politicians, and a view that made even Marcus's impressive window seem modest. But as he settled into the chair across from her desk, Marcus noticed that Patricia seemed uncomfortable in a way he'd never seen before. "I'll cut right to the chase," she began, her fingers drumming against her desk. "We need to discuss your future here at Pinnacle." The words hit Marcus like a physical punch. "My future? Patricia, if this is about Richardson, it's not just about Richardson, Marcus." Though that situation did highlight some concerns that the partners have been discussing. "What concerns?" Marcus leaned forward, his mind racing. "My performance reviews have been exceptional. I've brought in more new business than anyone in my position. The Henderson campaign I led last year exceeded client expectations by 30%. Patricia nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right about your performance metrics. That's what makes this conversation so difficult." She reached for a folder on her desk, and Marcus noticed her hands were slightly trembling. "Marcus, I want you to understand that this isn't personal. You're talented, hardworking, and creative. Under different circumstances, I believe you'd have a long and successful career here." Different circumstances. Marcus felt his throat constricting. "What does that mean?" "It means that fit isn't just about ability. It's about compatibility with our client base, our company culture, our long-term strategic direction." There was that word again, fit. Marcus stared at Patricia, waiting for her to elaborate, but she seemed to be struggling with how to continue. "Are you firing me?" he asked quietly. "We're offering you a very generous severance package," she replied, sliding the folder across the desk. 3 months' salary, full benefits continuation, and we'll provide excellent references for your job search." Marcus opened the folder with hands that weren't quite steady. The paperwork was thorough, professional, and completely devastating. "Can you at least tell me the real reason? I think I deserve that much." Patricia was quiet for so long that Marcus wondered if she'd heard him. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual. "Marcus, you're a brilliant marketer, but you don't understand the game you're playing. This industry isn't just about talent or creativity or even results. It's about relationships, legacy, connections, and frankly, image. Our clients expect a certain aesthetic when they partner with Pinnacle. They want their account managers to reflect their brand values, to fit seamlessly into their corporate culture. You're exceptional at what you do, but you're not what they're looking for visually." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as the meaning of Patricia's words became clear. This wasn't about his performance or his potential. It was about who he was, where he came from, how he looked, what he represented to clients who valued aesthetic over ability. "So you're telling me that 3 years of exceptional work mean nothing because I don't look the part?" Patricia's expression was pained. "Marcus, I wish the world worked differently. I really do. But I have a responsibility to this company and to our shareholders. We can't afford to lose clients because they're uncomfortable with having a black account manager." Marcus finished a sentence she couldn't bring herself to say. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's inability to deny it was confirmation enough. Marcus closed the folder and stood up slowly. "I need some time to process this." "Take all the time you need. The severance offer is generous, and we're hoping this transition can be as smooth as possible for everyone involved." Walking back to his office felt like a death march. The hallways that had once seemed like paths to opportunity now felt like corridors leading to an exit he'd never chosen. Colleagues who made eye contact offered weak smiles that only emphasized their relief that they weren't in his position. Sarah was waiting in his office when he arrived, her expression a mixture of concern and guilt. "I heard about the meeting," she said softly. "Marcus, I'm so sorry." "Did you know this was coming?" he asked, settling heavily into his chair. She nodded slowly. "I heard rumors. There were partner meetings where your name came up, discussions about client compatibility and strategic alignment. I hoped it was just office gossip." Marcus stared out his window at the construction site across the street. The workers were making steady progress, each day building something tangible and permanent. His own 3 years of work felt like it was being erased with a few signatures on severance papers. "What's really frustrating," he said, his voice quiet but intense, "is that I actually believed merit mattered. I thought if I worked hard enough, was smart enough, delivered results consistently enough, that would be sufficient. I was naive enough to think that in 2023, in a major American city, talent would trump everything else." Sarah sat on the edge of his desk, the same spot she'd occupied countless times during happier conversations. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet. For the first time in my adult life, I honestly have no idea what comes next." That evening, Marcus found himself walking through his old neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. The streets looked smaller than he remembered, the buildings more worn, but there was an authenticity here that his corporate world had lacked. He stopped by Rose's corner store, where he'd bought candy as a kid, and found Mrs. Rodriguez behind the counter, older but still sharp-eyed. "Marcus Williams," she exclaimed in accented English. "Look at you in that fancy suit. Your mama must be so proud." "Hi, Mrs. Rodriguez. How have you been?" "Getting by, Mijo. But I heard you were working downtown, making good money. Living the dream, right?" Marcus smiled, but it felt hollow. "Something like that." He bought a coffee and sat on the steps outside the store, watching kids play basketball in the small park across the street. Their laughter and competitive banter reminded him of his own childhood, when success seemed like a distant but achievable goal. Back then, he'd believed that education and hard work were guaranteed tickets to a better life. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "How was work today, baby? I keep telling the ladies at church about my successful son." Marcus stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "Work was fine, Mom. I love you." As darkness fell over the neighborhood, Marcus realized that his exclusion from Pinnacle wasn't just about losing a job, it was about confronting the gap between the American dream he'd been sold and the American reality he was living. The meritocracy he'd believed in didn't actually exist, at least not in the way he'd understood it. But as he walked back toward his car, Marcus felt something unexpected stirring beneath the disappointment and anger. It was a kind of clarity he'd never experienced before, a stripping away of illusions that, while painful, was also oddly liberating. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to fit into someone else's definition of success. The question now was what to do with that freedom. Walking through the streets where he'd grown up, Marcus began to see his exclusion not as an ending, but as a forced opportunity to discover who he really was when he wasn't trying to be who others expected him to be. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. He didn't know it yet, but this moment of complete professional devastation would become the foundation for something entirely new, not just a different career, but a different way of understanding success, authenticity, and his own power to create the life he actually wanted rather than the life he thought he was supposed to want. 2 months into unemployment, Marcus had established a routine that would have horrified his former corporate self. He woke up without an alarm, made coffee in his small kitchen while still wearing pajamas, and spent his mornings reading not business journals or industry reports, but books he'd always meant to explore: philosophy, psychology, biographies of people who'd built something from nothing. The Chicago winter had arrived with its characteristic brutality, but Marcus found odd comfort in the cold. It matched his internal state, harsh, unforgiving, but somehow clarifying. His savings account was shrinking steadily, but his understanding of himself was expanding in ways he'd never anticipated. "You look different," his mother observed during one of their weekly dinners at her small apartment in Bronzeville. Denise Williams was a woman who noticed everything, a skill developed through 30 years as a nurse in Chicago's public hospital system. "Different how?" Marcus asked, helping her clear the dishes from their meal of baked chicken and collard greens, comfort food that tasted like childhood, more like yourself, if that makes sense. "For the past few years, when you'd visit, you seemed like you were wearing a costume. Now you just seem like Marcus." Her observation struck him as profound. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Mom, about what I really want. Not just what I thought I was supposed to want." Denise settled into her favorite chair, the same one she'd occupied for as long as Marcus could remember. "You know, when you got that job at the fancy marketing company, I was so proud. But I was also a little worried." "Worried about what?" "That you might lose yourself trying to become someone else. Your father used to say that success without authenticity is just an expensive form of failure." Marcus's father had died when he was 12, but his mother kept his wisdom alive through stories and sayings that had shaped Marcus's childhood. He'd forgotten many of those lessons during his climb up the corporate ladder. "I think I'm starting to understand what he meant," Marcus said 3 days later. Marcus found himself in an unexpected place, volunteering at a community center in Pilsen, the neighborhood where he'd lived during college. He hadn't planned to volunteer. He'd simply been walking through the area, reminiscing about his student days, when he noticed a sign asking for help with a youth entrepreneurship program. "You sure you want to do this?" asked Carmen Gutierrez, the program director. She was a woman in her 40s who radiated the kind of practical energy that came from years of community work. "These kids can be pretty direct. They don't have much patience for people who are just trying to feel good about themselves." "I'm not trying to feel good about myself," Marcus replied. "I'm trying to figure out how to be useful." The program met in a converted classroom where 15 teenagers, mostly Black and Latino, gathered twice a week to learn basic business concepts. Marcus's first session was humbling. The kids saw through any hint of condescension immediately and challenged every assumption he made about entrepreneurship and success. "So you're telling us to start businesses," said Jasmine, a 17-year-old with natural hair and intelligent eyes. "But you just got fired from your fancy job. Why should we listen to you?" The question was brutal and fair. Marcus had mentioned his recent departure from Pinnacle during his introduction, framing it diplomatically as a career transition. "You're absolutely right to question that," he said. "I got fired because I thought success meant fitting into someone else's system. I spent 3 years trying to be what I thought a successful person looked like instead of figuring out what success meant to me." Another student, Miguel, leaned forward. "So what's success mean to you now?" Marcus paused, realizing he was still figuring that out. "I'm not sure yet, but I know it's not about impressing people who were never going to accept me anyway." The honesty seemed to resonate. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself looking forward to the sessions more than any meeting he'd ever attended at Pinnacle. The students' questions forced him to examine his assumptions about business, success, and authenticity in ways that MBA courses never had. "Why do all these business books assume we want to work 80-hour weeks?" asked David, a 16-year-old, whose family had immigrated from Guatemala when he was 5. "Why do they act like the only way to be successful is to start the next Google?" added Jasmine. "What if we just want to solve problems in our own communities?" Their questions sparked something in Marcus that had been dormant during his corporate years: genuine curiosity about alternative models of success. He began researching social entrepreneurs, cooperative businesses, and community-based economic development models that prioritized impact over pure profit. One evening, while preparing for the next session, Marcus came across the story of a woman who'd been excluded from the tech industry's boys' club and had gone on to create a successful platform connecting minority entrepreneurs with resources and mentorship. Her story resonated so deeply that Marcus found himself taking notes not for his students, but for himself. That night, unable to sleep, Marcus sat at his laptop and began writing. Not a business plan or a marketing strategy, but simply his thoughts about exclusion, authenticity, and the gap between what people were told success looked like and what it actually meant for people who didn't fit traditional molds. He wrote about the Richardson presentation and the conversation with Patricia Holmes. He wrote about the community center kids who were building businesses around their passions rather than chasing someone else's definition of achievement. He wrote about his mother's wisdom and his father's sayings and the strange liberation that came from having nothing left to lose. When he finally stopped writing, it was nearly a.m., and he had 17 pages of raw, honest reflection on his experience. On impulse, he created a simple blog and posted the essay with the title, "What I Learned When I Stopped Trying to Fit In." Marcus didn't expect anyone to read it. Within a week, the post had been shared hundreds of times. His email inbox filled with messages from people who related to his story, professionals who'd faced similar exclusions, entrepreneurs who'd built businesses around their authentic values rather than market expectations, individuals who were struggling to define success on their own terms. One email particularly caught his attention. It was from a woman named Lisa Park, who identified herself as a venture capitalist focused on funding entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities. "Marcus," she wrote, "your essay articulated something I've been feeling for years but couldn't express. I'd love to buy you coffee and talk about what you're planning to do next." For the first time since leaving Pinnacle, Marcus felt a spark of genuine excitement about his professional future. Not because someone was offering him a job or an opportunity, but because he was beginning to see a path forward that aligned with who he actually was rather than who he'd thought he needed to become. That evening, Marcus called his mother. "I think I'm starting to understand something important," he told her. "What's that, baby?" "Being excluded from something that wasn't right for me wasn't actually a failure. It was a redirection towards something that is." Denise Williams smiled on the other end of the phone. She'd been waiting 3 years for her son to discover what she'd always known, that his greatest strength wasn't his ability to fit in, but his capacity to stand out in ways that mattered. Marcus hung up the phone and opened his laptop. He had more writing to do. The coffee shop Lisa Park suggested for their meeting was in Logan Square, a neighborhood that perfectly embodied Chicago's mix of gentrification and authenticity. Marcus arrived early, choosing a corner table where he could observe the eclectic crowd: hipster entrepreneurs typing intensely on MacBooks, construction workers grabbing quick breakfasts, artists sketching in notebooks over endless refills. Lisa arrived exactly on time, a detail that Marcus appreciated. She was a Korean-American woman in her early 40s, dressed casually but expensively, with the kind of confident energy that came from years of making decisions that moved millions of dollars. "I've been thinking about your blog post since I read it," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from him. "Particularly your point about the difference between fitting in and belonging." Marcus had been nervous about this meeting, unsure what to expect from someone who operated at the level of venture capital. But Lisa's directness put him at ease. "I've been thinking about that distinction too," he replied. "I spent so much energy trying to fit into Pinnacle's culture that I never stopped to ask whether I actually belong there." "Belonging requires authenticity," Lisa said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Fitting in just requires performance. The question is, what happens when people stop performing and start building something authentic instead?" Over the next hour, Lisa shared her own story of exclusion and redirection. Despite an MBA from Wharton and a decade of experience in traditional venture capital, she'd repeatedly been passed over for partnerships at established firms. Instead of continuing to fight for acceptance, she'd raised her own fund focused specifically on entrepreneurs who looked like the people she'd grown up with rather than the people who typically populated Silicon Valley. "The most interesting innovations are happening in communities that traditional VCs ignore," she explained. "But those entrepreneurs face the same challenges you faced at Pinnacle. They're trying to fit into systems that weren't designed for them." Marcus leaned forward. "So what's the alternative?" "Build new systems. Create platforms and resources that serve people who've been excluded from traditional ones. Stop asking to be included and start building something worth joining." The conversation sparked ideas that Marcus hadn't fully formed but had been circling around since his first day at the community center. What if there was a way to connect excluded professionals with each other? What if people who'd been pushed out of traditional systems could build something better together? I have a proposition for you, Lisa said as their meeting wound down. I'm looking for someone to lead a new initiative, a platform that connects underrepresented entrepreneurs with resources, mentorship, and community. It's not a charity or a feel-good diversity program. It's a business built on the premise that excluded talent is undervalued talent, which represents massive market opportunity. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Tell me more. I'm prepared to provide initial funding and strategic support for someone to build this from the ground up. But I need someone who understands exclusion viscerally, not just intellectually. Someone who's been through the process of having their authentic self rejected and has come out stronger on the other side. That evening, Marcus walked through Grant Park as snow began to fall over Chicago. The city looked different in winter, harsher but more honest, stripped of the decorations that made things pretty and revealed what was actually strong enough to survive. He thought about Lisa's offer and about the kids at the community center, who were building businesses around their passions rather than market expectations. He thought about his mother's pride in his corporate success and her relief when he'd started seeming like himself again. He thought about his father saying that success without authenticity was just expensive failure. Most of all, he thought about the hundreds of emails he'd received from people who'd connected with his story about exclusion and redirection. Each message represented someone who'd been pushed out of a system that wasn't serving them anyway, someone who might be ready to build something better. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Lisa. "I'm interested," he said when she answered. "But I want to make sure I understand what we're building. This isn't about helping people fit into existing systems better. It's about creating alternative systems that work for people who don't fit traditional molds." "Exactly," Lisa replied. "Are you ready to stop asking for permission to succeed and start building something worth joining instead?" Marcus looked up at the Chicago skyline, the buildings he'd once dreamed of conquering now seeming less important than the community he was beginning to envision building. "I'm ready," he said. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into research and planning with an energy he'd never felt during his corporate years. He interviewed dozens of entrepreneurs who'd faced exclusion and built successful businesses. Anyway, he studied alternative business models, cooperative structures, and community-based economic development strategies. Most importantly, he continued working with the students at the community center, treating them not as recipients of his knowledge but as collaborators in developing a platform that would actually serve people like them. "So this thing you're building," Jasmine asked during one of their sessions, "it's like LinkedIn but for people who LinkedIn doesn't work for." "Something like that," Marcus replied. "But more than just networking. It's about creating a complete ecosystem: mentorship, funding, resources, community for people who've been excluded from traditional business networks." Miguel raised his hand. "What's to stop it from becoming just another exclusive club? How do you make sure it doesn't turn into the same thing that excluded you?" The question was brilliant and challenging. Marcus paused, considering. "By building inclusion into the structure from the beginning," he said finally. "By making sure the people who've been excluded are the ones making the decisions about how it works." 3 months after his meeting with Lisa, Marcus submitted a comprehensive business plan for what they'd decided to call Catalyst Collective, a platform designed to connect, support, and amplify entrepreneurs who'd been excluded from traditional business networks. The plan wasn't just about technology or market opportunity, though both were solid. It was about creating a new model of success that prioritized authenticity over assimilation, community impact over pure profit, and sustainable growth over rapid scaling at any cost. As Marcus prepared for the presentation that would determine whether Catalyst Collective became reality, he realized how different he felt from the men who'd pitched a Richardson Group less than a year ago. Then, he'd been trying to prove he belonged in their world. Now, he was inviting others to help build a world where belonging was the starting point, not the end goal. The presentation was scheduled for the following Monday. Marcus had never been more nervous or more confident about anything in his life. The presentation took place in Lisa's office in the West Loop, a space that managed to feel both professional and welcoming. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the Chicago River, and the walls displayed art from local artists rather than the generic corporate pieces Marcus had grown accustomed to at Pinnacle. Besides Lisa, two other people were present: James, Kim, a tech entrepreneur who'd built and sold 3 companies, and Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a business professor at Northwestern who specialized in social entrepreneurship. Marcus had never presented to investors before, but something about this group felt different from the corporate presentations he'd given in his previous life. "Before we start," Lisa said, "I want to set context. We're not evaluating whether this is a good business idea. We already believe it is. We're here to understand how you plan to build it and whether you're the right person to lead it." Marcus nodded, feeling some of his nervousness transform into focus. He'd spent weeks preparing not just slides, but a comprehensive vision for how Catalyst Collective would work. Catalyst Collective exists to solve a problem that affects millions of talented people, he began. They've been excluded from traditional business networks not because of their abilities, but because of who they are or where they come from. Instead of trying to fix those existing networks, we're building a new one designed around inclusion from the ground up. He clicked to his first slide, which showed statistics about entrepreneurship among underrepresented communities. The data shows that entrepreneurs from excluded communities actually have higher success rates than average when they get access to resources. But access is exactly what they're missing. James leaned forward. How does this differ from existing diversity-focused business organizations? 3 key ways, Marcus replied. First, we're not asking to be included in someone else's system, we're building our own. Second, we're focused on economic outcomes, not just networking. Third, we're designed to scale without losing the community aspects that make it valuable. He walked them through the platform's core features: a matching system that connected entrepreneurs with mentors who'd faced similar challenges, a funding network of investors specifically interested in underrepresented founders, and a resource library built around the unique challenges of building businesses outside traditional systems. But the real innovation, Marcus continued, is our community model. Every member contributes something: expertise, connections, resources, time, and everyone benefits. It's not a charity or a mentorship program. It's a mutual support network that gets stronger as it grows. Dr. Rodriguez spoke up. How do you prevent this from becoming just another exclusive club? What happens when it scales? Marcus smiled. It was the same question Miguel had asked at the community center, and he'd been thinking about it ever since. By embedding inclusion in our governance structure, decision-making power stays distributed among the community. As we grow, we maintain local chapters with autonomy to address their specific needs. And we measure success not just by revenue or membership numbers, but by the economic impact we create in excluded communities. The presentation continued for another hour, covering everything from revenue models to technology architecture to growth strategies. But what struck Marcus most was how different this felt from corporate presentations. The questions weren't designed to poke holes or assert dominance, they were collaborative, aimed at making the idea stronger. When he finished, Lisa smiled. Marcus, 6 months ago you were trying to fit into someone else's vision of success. Today you presented your own vision, and it's compelling precisely because it comes from authentic experience rather than market research. James nodded in agreement. The business model is solid, but what really convinces me is that you're building something you actually needed. That's the kind of product market fit that can't be faked. Dr. Rodriguez had been taking notes throughout the presentation. I'm particularly interested in your community governance model. It addresses the main criticism of diversity initiatives, that they're designed by people who don't share the experiences of the communities they claim to serve. Lisa looked at her colleagues, then back at Marcus. We're prepared to provide initial funding for Catalyst Collective. But more than that, we want to support you in building this the right way, sustainably, authentically, and with real impact. Marcus felt a surge of emotion that caught him off guard. This wasn't just professional validation, it was confirmation that his exclusion from Pinnacle had been a redirection towards something that aligned with his authentic purpose rather than just his career ambitions. There's one more thing, Lisa continued. We want this to be more than a business you run. We want you to build something that can outlast any individual leader, including yourself. That means developing other leaders from the community from day one. Over the following weeks, Marcus dove into the practical work of turning vision into reality. He rented a small office space in Bronzeville, choosing a location that was both affordable and symbolically important. This wasn't going to be another tech company trying to gentrify a neighborhood, but a business rooted in the community it aimed to serve. His first hire was Carmen Gutierrez, the community center director who'd become both a mentor and collaborator. Her decades of experience in community organizing brought a practical wisdom that complemented Marcus's business background. The kids have been asking when they can beta test your platform, Carmen told him during their first official meeting. As colleagues, they want to be your first users. That's exactly what I was hoping, Marcus replied. If we can't serve teenage entrepreneurs from Pilsen and Bronzeville, we're not going to serve anyone effectively. Their second hire was Jasmine, the 17-year-old from the community center who'd challenged Marcus during his first volunteer session. Now 18 and enrolled in community college, she brought both technical skills and the perspective of someone who'd grown up navigating systems that weren't designed for her. Most business platforms assume everyone has the same starting point, Jasmine observed during one of their planning sessions. But if your family doesn't have business connections, if you're the first person in your neighborhood to start a company, if you're working with limited resources, you need different tools. Marcus found himself learning as much from his team as he'd ever learned from any MBA course. Carmen's community organizing experience taught him about building sustainable movements rather than just profitable businesses. Jasmine's insights about technology and user experience came from someone who'd grown up digital but hadn't been considered in most platform designs. By spring, they'd developed a working prototype of Catalyst Collective. The interface was clean and intuitive, but what made it special was how it approached networking differently. Instead of emphasizing credentials and connections, it focused on shared challenges and complementary needs. Look at this, Jasmine said, showing Marcus a beta tester interaction. Maria in Phoenix is starting a catering business, and she got connected with David in Atlanta, who faced similar licensing challenges last year. But then David also introduced her to his supplier in Arizona, who gives discounts to minority-owned businesses. It's not just one-on-one mentoring, it's building a network that actually helps people. The first public launch event took place at the community center where Marcus had started volunteering. The room was packed with entrepreneurs, students, community leaders, and curious neighbors. Marcus looked out at the diverse crowd and realized this was what belonging actually looked like, not people who looked the same or came from the same background, but people who shared common values and supported each other's growth. 6 months ago, Marcus began his remarks. I thought being excluded from a job was the worst thing that could happen to my career. Tonight, I realized it was the best thing that could happen to my life. He talked about the difference between fitting in and belonging, between individual success and community prosperity, between trying to change systems that rejected you and building new systems that welcomed everyone from the start. Catalyst Collective isn't just a business platform, he continued. It's a bet that excluded talent is undervalued talent, and that when we connect people who've been pushed out of traditional systems, we create something better than what we were excluded from. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week of launch, they had over 500 registered users. Within a month, that number had grown to 2,000. But more importantly, the interactions were meaningful, real mentorship relationships, actual business collaborations, concrete resources being shared. Marcus received an email that particularly moved him. It was from a woman named Patricia, not Patricia Holmes from Pinnacle, but Patricia Johnson, a 45-year-old former teacher who was starting a tutoring business in Detroit. I've been trying to network in traditional business groups for 2 years, she wrote, and I always felt like I was speaking a different language. In 1 week on Catalyst Collective, I've connected with 3 mentors, found a supplier for my educational materials, and met another tutor interested in partnership. For the first time, I feel like I'm in a place where people understand what I'm trying to build and why it matters. That evening, Marcus called his mother with an update on the business. "You sound different again," Denise observed. "Different? How this time?" "Happy. Not just successful or proud, but genuinely happy. Like you're doing what you're supposed to be doing." Marcus looked around his small apartment, which was now cluttered with business plans, user feedback, and prototypes for new features. It was messier than his life had been during his corporate days, but it felt more authentic. "I think I am, Mom. For the first time in my adult life, I think I'm building something that actually matters to me." As Chicago's spring turned into summer, Catalyst Collective continued growing, but more importantly, it was creating the kind of impact Marcus had hoped for. Members were launching businesses, finding mentors, accessing funding, and building the kinds of professional relationships that had been gate-kept by traditional networks. The platform was succeeding not because it had found a way to break into existing systems, but because it had created an alternative system that worked better for people who'd been excluded from the original ones. Marcus was beginning to understand that his exclusion from Pinnacle hadn't been a detour from his path, it had been the path itself, leading him toward work that aligned with his values rather than just his ambitions. But the biggest test was still ahead. Success was one thing. Sustaining that success while staying true to their founding principles was another challenge entirely. By early fall, Catalyst Collective had reached 10,000 members across 15 cities. The growth was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Marcus found himself fielding calls from major corporations wanting to partner with the platform, investors interested in scaling rapidly, and journalists asking whether Catalyst Collective was the next big thing in social entrepreneurship. The attention was validating, but it also brought pressures that Marcus hadn't anticipated. His small team was working around the clock to support the growing community, and the platform's success was creating new challenges that success manuals didn't cover. "We need to talk about the Facebook situation," Carmen said during their Monday morning team meeting. She was referring to a message that had been circulating among members over the weekend, a heated debate about whether Catalyst Collective should accept advertising revenue from companies with questionable diversity records. "What exactly happened?" Marcus asked, though he'd already seen the controversy brewing in their member forums. Jasmine, now their head of community engagement, pulled up the relevant threads on her laptop. "It started when someone posted about a job opening at a major tech company. Other members started sharing their experiences interviewing. Their mostly stories about being excluded or tokenized. Then people began arguing about whether we should take their advertising money." Marcus rubbed his temples. This was exactly the kind of complexity he'd hoped to avoid but had always known would eventually surface. "What are members saying?" "It's split," Carmen replied. "Some people think we should take money from any company willing to pay, especially if we can use those resources to serve more excluded entrepreneurs. Others think accepting money from companies that perpetuate exclusion undermines our credibility. And a third group," Jasmine added, "thinks we should take the money, but use our platform to hold these companies accountable for their practices." Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling of their small office. Success had been simpler when Catalyst Collective was just an idea. Now that it was a real business affecting real people's lives, every decision carried weight he'd never experienced in corporate marketing. "What does our community governance model say about this?" he asked. Carmen smiled. "That's the good news. The structure you built actually works. We can put this to a community vote and let members decide how they want us to handle corporate partnerships." Over the next week, Marcus watched their community engage in the kind of democratic decision-making that most businesses never attempted. Members debated, shared experiences, proposed alternatives, and ultimately voted on a policy that none of them could have developed alone. The decision was nuanced. Catalyst Collective would accept advertising from companies, but only those that met specific diversity and inclusion criteria. More importantly, they would create transparency reports showing which companies were making genuine progress and which were just talking about change. "This is fascinating," Dr. Rodriguez observed, when Marcus updated her on the situation. "You've essentially created a business that governs itself. Most companies face these ethical questions internally, among executives and board members. You're letting your community wrestle with them democratically. It's messier than traditional corporate decision-making, Marcus admitted, but the decisions feel more legitimate because they come from the people who'll be affected by them. The corporate partnership debate was just one of several growing pains that fall. Another challenge emerged when Catalyst Collective received an acquisition offer from a major professional networking company, an offer that could have made Marcus wealthy overnight but would have fundamentally changed the platform's mission. $25 million, Lisa said, reviewing the offer documents in her office. That's substantial money for a company that's barely a year old. Marcus had been expecting this conversation. The acquiring company was well regarded and financially sound, but their track record on diversity and inclusion was mixed at best. What's your gut reaction? Lisa asked. That this would be the end of what we're actually building. Marcus replied without hesitation. They want our user base and our technology, but they don't understand our community model. Within 6 months, Catalyst Collective would become just another diversity initiative inside a traditional corporate structure. Lisa nodded. I agree, but I want to make sure you're thinking through all the implications. This offer represents financial security for you personally, and it would provide resources to serve more entrepreneurs. Marcus had been thinking about little else since the offer arrived. The question is whether we can serve more entrepreneurs by scaling within someone else's system or by continuing to build an alternative system. I think the answer is the latter, even if it means slower growth and more uncertainty, especially if it means that fast growth inside someone else's system would just be another form of assimilation. We'd be asking permission to exist instead of building something worth joining. That evening, Marcus walked through his old neighborhood, ending up at Rose's corner store where Mrs. Rodriguez was, as always, behind the counter. Marcus, I keep hearing about this business you started. People are talking about it at church, saying you're helping folks start their own companies. Something like that, Marcus replied, buying the same coffee he'd purchased during his lowest moment a year earlier. You know what I think? Mrs. Rodriguez continued. I think sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is not getting what you thought you wanted. Makes room for what you actually needed. Her words stayed with Marcus as he prepared for the team meeting where they would discuss the acquisition offer. When he presented his recommendation to decline, he was nervous about their reaction. Are you crazy? Jasmine asked, but she was smiling. Do you know what I could do with my share of $25 million? Carmen laughed. I think what Jasmine is really asking is whether you're sure this is the right decision for the community we're serving. That's exactly what I'm asking, Jasmine confirmed. Because if this acquisition would let us serve more people better, then maybe we should consider it. But if it would just make us rich while diluting our impact, then no amount of money is worth it. Marcus looked at his team, Carmen with her decades of community organizing experience, Jasmine with her sharp insights about technology and user experience, and realized that the decision wasn't really his to make alone. What if we do what we did with the corporate partnership policy? He suggested. Put it to the community and let our members decide whether they want us to accept this acquisition. It was an unusual approach. Most companies didn't ask their users to vote on major business decisions, but Catalyst Collective wasn't most companies. The community vote took place over a week of intense discussion. Members shared their experiences with other platforms that had been acquired, debated the pros and cons of rapid scaling, and ultimately reached a decision that surprised even Marcus with its clarity. 87% voted to decline the acquisition offer. More importantly, the comments accompanying the votes revealed a community that understood exactly what they were choosing and why. I joined Catalyst Collective because it's different from LinkedIn and other networking platforms, wrote one member. If it gets absorbed into a traditional company, it becomes just another corporate diversity program. The value isn't in the technology, wrote another. It's in the community and the values. Those can be acquired, they have to be grown. Marcus sent the declining response to the acquiring company that Friday, feeling more confident about a business decision than he'd ever felt in his corporate career. But he also knew that turning down $25 million meant they needed to find sustainable ways to fund their growth without compromising their mission. That challenge would define the next phase of Catalyst Collective's evolution, proving that alternative business models could scale without assimilating into the systems they were designed to replace. As Marcus locked up the office that evening, he reflected on how much had changed since his exclusion from Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. Back then, he'd measured success by external validation: salary, title, corner office, impressive clients. Now he measured it by community impact, authentic relationships, and alignment between values and actions. The irony wasn't lost on him. Being excluded from someone else's definition of success had freed him to create his own. The morning of Catalyst Collective's first annual conference, Marcus stood in the convention center in downtown Chicago, watching volunteers set up registration tables and testing microphones on the main stage. In 18 months, what had started as a simple platform for connecting excluded entrepreneurs had evolved into a movement that was reshaping how people thought about business, community, and success. Nervous, Carmen asked, joining him as he surveyed the organized chaos of conference preparation. Terrified, Marcus admitted. When we started, I worried about whether anyone would use the platform. Now I'm worried about whether we can live up to what people expect from us. The conference had drawn 800 attendees from across the country: entrepreneurs, investors, community organizers, and students who'd come to Chicago to learn, network, and celebrate what they'd built together. But for Marcus, the event represented something bigger than business development. It was a test of whether Catalyst Collective could maintain its community-focused values while operating at scale. You know what's amazing? Jasmine said, approaching, with her tablet full of last-minute logistics. Look at the speaker lineup. 2 years ago, most of these people had never been invited to speak at business conferences. Now they're the experts everyone wants to hear from. She was right. The conference agenda featured entrepreneurs who'd built successful businesses outside traditional systems: a formerly incarcerated man who'd started a construction company that hired people with criminal records, an immigrant woman who'd created a micro-lending platform for her community, a disabled veteran who'd developed assistive technology through his own startup. These are the people who understand resilience and innovation in ways that traditional business conferences never capture, Marcus said. They've had to be creative because they've been excluded from conventional resources. The opening keynote was delivered by Dr. Angela Rodriguez, who had become both an advisor and advocate for Catalyst Collective. Her speech focused on what she called authentic entrepreneurship, building businesses that aligned with personal values rather than chasing market trends. Traditional business education teaches us to identify market opportunities and develop products to capture them, she told the packed auditorium. But authentic entrepreneurship starts with understanding your own story, your community's needs, and your values. The market opportunity emerges from that authenticity, not the other way around. Marcus listened from the side of the stage, struck by how different this felt from corporate conferences he'd attended during his Pinnacle years. There, speakers talked about disrupting markets and scaling rapidly. Here, they talked about building sustainably and serving communities. The day continued with workshops that reflected Catalyst Collective's community-driven approach. Instead of traditional panels where experts talked at audiences, they'd organize collaborative sessions where attendees shared knowledge with each other. In one workshop, titled Funding Without Compromise, entrepreneurs shared strategies for raising capital while maintaining control over their mission and values. Marcus sat in on the session and was struck by the sophistication of the discussion. These weren't people complaining about exclusion from traditional funding. They were creating alternative funding models that worked better for their needs. The key's understanding that not all money is the same, explained Maria Santos, a fintech entrepreneur who'd raised $2 million without giving up equity or decision-making power. Some money comes with strings that change your business in ways you didn't intend. Other money comes with support that makes your business stronger. During the lunch break, Marcus found himself in conversation with David Chan, a journalist who was covering the conference for a major business publication. "What strikes me about this event," David said, "is how different the energy feels from typical business conferences. People seem genuinely interested in each other's success, not just their own networking opportunities." Marcus nodded. "That's intentional. We designed everything from the platform to this conference around mutual support rather than individual achievement. When people succeed here, it strengthens the whole community. But doesn't that approach limit scalability? Traditional business models prioritize rapid growth and market capture." "Maybe," Marcus replied. "But we're not trying to scale in traditional ways. We're trying to scale impact and community strength, which requires different metrics and different approaches." The afternoon's highlight was a panel discussion titled "Exclusion as Innovation." 5 entrepreneurs shared stories about how being pushed out of traditional systems had forced them to develop better solutions. "When banks wouldn't lend to women in my community," shared Rosa Gutierrez, who'd started a cooperative lending circle, "we created our own financial system. Now our model is being studied by community development organizations across the country." "Being excluded from tech industry networking forced me to build relationships differently," added Kevin Washington, a software developer who'd created a platform connecting Black technologists. "The relationships I built outside traditional networks have been stronger and more supportive than anything I experienced in corporate environments." Marcus was the panel's final speaker. As he looked out at the audience, he saw faces that reflected the diversity of American entrepreneurship in ways that traditional business conferences rarely captured. 18 months ago, I thought exclusion was failure," he began. "I believed success meant convincing gatekeepers to let me into their systems. But exclusion taught me something more valuable, that the systems that exclude us might not be systems worth joining." He talked about the journey from Pinnacle Marketing Solutions to Catalyst Collective, from trying to fit into building something worth belonging to. "The most important lesson I've learned is that exclusion isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. It preserves existing power structures by making talented people feel like the problem is their inability to assimilate. But when we stop trying to assimilate and start building alternatives, we create something better than what we were excluded from." The response was immediate and emotional. Marcus saw people in the audience nodding, some wiping away tears, others taking notes furiously. But what moved him most was seeing Jasmine in the front row. The teenager who'd challenged him during his first volunteer session and had become one of his most important collaborators. After the panel, Marcus was approached by Patricia Holmes, his former boss from Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. He hadn't seen her since the day she'd offered him the severance package, and her presence at the conference was completely unexpected. "Marcus," she said, extending her hand, "congratulations on what you've built here. It's impressive." Marcus shook her hand, feeling oddly calm despite the emotional weight of the encounter. "Thank you for coming, Patricia. What brought you to the conference?" "Honestly, curiosity. I've been following Catalyst Collective's growth, and I wanted to understand what we missed when we let you go." Her directness caught Marcus off guard. "What do you think you missed?" Patricia looked around the bustling conference hall, taking in the energy and engagement that was palpable throughout the space. "We missed understanding that exclusion creates innovation," she said finally. "We thought we were protecting our client relationships by maintaining certain aesthetics, but we were actually limiting our ability to serve clients who were looking for fresh perspectives and authentic connections to diverse markets." Marcus appreciated her honesty, even if it came 2 years too late. "So what's Pinnacle doing differently now?" "We're trying to change, but it's harder than I expected. You can't just hire diverse employees and expect them to thrive in systems that weren't designed for inclusion. We're learning that real change requires rebuilding structures, not just adjusting policies." Their conversation was interrupted by Jasmine, who approached with characteristic directness. "Are you the woman who fired Marcus?" she asked Patricia. Patricia looked surprised but answered, "Honestly, Yes, I am. Jasmine studied her for a moment, then smiled. Well, thank you. If you hadn't pushed him out, he never would have built this community. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to someone is not getting what they thought they wanted. After Patricia left, Marcus found himself reflecting on the strange circularity of his journey. The exclusion that had felt like an ending had actually been a beginning. The rejection that had seemed like failure had redirected him toward work that aligned with his authentic purpose. As the conference wound down that evening, Marcus addressed the attendees one final time. When we started Catalyst Collective, I thought we were building a business platform, he said. But what we've actually built is a community that proves excluded talent is undervalued talent. We've shown that when people who've been pushed out of traditional systems come together, we create something better than what we were excluded from. He paused, looking out at faces that represented the future of American entrepreneurship: diverse, resilient, innovative, and authentically connected to the communities they served. The question now isn't whether this model works, we've proven that. The question is whether we can scale it without losing what makes it special, whether we can grow while staying true to the values that brought us together. The applause was sustained and emotional, but Marcus knew the real test wasn't the conference's success. It was whether Catalyst Collective could continue growing while maintaining its community-centered approach, its commitment to authentic relationships, and its focus on serving people who'd been excluded from traditional systems. As he helped volunteers clean up that evening, Marcus realized that the conference had answered a question he'd been carrying since the early days of the platform. Catalyst Collective wasn't just a business that happened to serve an underrepresented market. It was a different model of business entirely, one that prioritized community strength over individual achievement, sustainable growth over rapid scaling, and authentic relationships over transactional networking. The challenge now was proving that this model could succeed not just in Chicago, not just among entrepreneurs who'd been excluded from traditional systems, but as a legitimate alternative to the business-as-usual approach that had excluded them in the first place. 2 years after the first Catalyst Collective conference, Marcus found himself in an unexpected position, testifying before a congressional subcommittee on small business and entrepreneurship. The invitation had come from Representative Maria Gonzalez, a congresswoman from Texas who'd been following Catalyst Collective's impact on entrepreneurship in underrepresented communities. Sitting in the hearing room in Washington, D.C., Marcus reflected on how surreal his journey had become. 3 years earlier, he'd been fired from a marketing job in Chicago. Now he was being asked to advise federal policymakers on supporting entrepreneurship among excluded populations. Mr. Williams, Representative Gonzalez began, your platform has facilitated over $50 million in business transactions among entrepreneurs who traditionally struggle to access capital and networks. Can you explain how Catalyst Collective achieved these results? Marcus leaned into the microphone, choosing his words carefully. Representative Gonzalez, the key insight is that excluded entrepreneurs aren't failing because they lack talent or drive. They're struggling because they've been shut out of the networks and resources that make business success possible. When you create alternative systems designed around inclusion rather than exclusion, the results speak for themselves. But how do you scale inclusion? Asked Representative Thompson, a Republican from Ohio. Traditional business networks evolved organically around shared experiences and relationships. Can engineered inclusion produce the same results? It was a fair question, one that Marcus had wrestled with as Catalyst Collective grew beyond his ability to personally know every member. Representative Thompson, what we've learned is that inclusion isn't something you engineer, it's something you embed in your foundational structure. From day one, Catalyst Collective was designed by people who'd experienced exclusion, governed by community input, and measured by collective success rather than individual achievement. Marcus went on to explain their community governance model, their approach to democratic decision-making, and their focus on mutual support rather than traditional networking. The questions from the committee members revealed both genuine interest and skepticism about whether these approaches could inform broader policy initiatives. After the hearing, Marcus was approached by Dr. Sarah Kim, a policy researcher from the Brookings Institution who'd been studying alternative business models. "Your testimony was compelling," she said, "but I'm curious about something you didn't mention. How do you handle the criticism that Catalyst Collective is essentially creating parallel segregation separate systems for people who can't succeed in mainstream ones?" Marcus had heard this criticism before, usually from people who benefited from existing systems and were uncomfortable with alternatives that didn't require their gatekeeping. Dr. Kim, that criticism assumes that mainstream systems are neutral and merit-based, and that people are excluded only because they can't compete. But when systems consistently exclude talented people based on factors unrelated to ability, background, appearance, connections, then the systems themselves are the problem, not the people they exclude. So you're arguing for replacement rather than reform? I'm arguing for choice. People should be able to build businesses within existing systems or create new systems that work better for their communities. Competition between models ultimately benefits everyone. That evening, Marcus had dinner with Lisa Park, who'd flown to DC to attend the hearing. They met at a small restaurant in Georgetown, away from the political atmosphere of Capitol Hill. "How do you feel about the congressional attention?" Lisa asked. Marcus considered the question. "Honored but also cautious. Government interest in what we're doing could be helpful, but it could also change the nature of what we've built. The moment we start optimizing for policy outcomes instead of community needs, we risk losing what makes us effective." That's a mature perspective. 3 years ago, you might have been thrilled by any form of official recognition. 3 years ago, I thought success meant impressing people who would never actually value what I brought to the table. Now I understand that the real measure of success is whether we're serving the people who depend on what we've built. Their conversation was interrupted by Marcus's phone buzzing with a message from Carmen. "Turn on Channel 7 News. They're doing a story on the Chicago entrepreneur who's revolutionizing small business support." Marcus and Lisa found a bar with televisions and watched a 5-minute news segment about Catalyst Collective. The story featured interviews with 3 entrepreneurs who'd used the platform to launch successful businesses, including Maria Santos, the fintech entrepreneur who'd spoken at their first conference. "What's different about Catalyst Collective?" Maria explained to the reporter. "Is that it treats entrepreneurship as a community activity rather than individual competition. When someone succeeds on the platform, they're expected to turn around and help others succeed too." The segment concluded with footage from their recent conference, showing the diversity and energy of their community. "It's surreal," Marcus said, watching himself on television talking about building authentic business relationships. "Its impact," Lisa corrected. "The story they're telling isn't about you personally, it's about a model that's working for people who've been underserved by traditional approaches." The next morning, Marcus flew back to Chicago and went directly to their expanded office in Bronzeville. Catalyst Collective now employed 15 people full-time and had partnered with organizations in 37 cities. But despite the growth, Marcus was determined to maintain the community-focused culture that had made their early success possible. "How was Washington?" Jasmine asked. She was now their director of community engagement, having finished her associate's degree while working full-time for the organization. "Educational," Marcus replied, "but also a reminder of why we built this outside traditional systems rather than trying to reform them from within." "What do you mean?" The questions from the committee members showed they're still thinking about inclusion as something you add to existing structures rather than something you build from the ground up. They want to understand our methods so they can apply them to traditional programs, but they don't want to question whether those traditional programs should exist in the first place. Carmen joined their conversation, carrying a stack of applications from entrepreneurs seeking mentorship through the platform. "Speaking of traditional programs," she said, "we received an interesting request yesterday. The Small Business Administration wants to partner with us to expand access to federal programs for underrepresented entrepreneurs." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What kind of partnership?" "They want to use our platform to connect SPA resources with our community. In exchange, they'd Provide funding for us to expand into rural communities where entrepreneurship support is limited. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that Marcus would have jumped at during his corporate days: official recognition, government funding, and the chance to scale rapidly. But now he felt cautious. What's our community saying about it? Mixed reactions, Jasmine replied. Some people are excited about accessing federal resources. Others worry about government bureaucracy affecting our community culture. And others, Carmen added, think we should maintain independence so we can continue advocating for systemic changes without conflicts of interest. Marcus smiled. The fact that their community was having sophisticated discussions about the implications of potential partnerships showed how much they'd all grown since the platform's early days. Let's put it to a community vote, he decided. But first, let's research exactly what this partnership would require and what it would mean for our governance model. That afternoon, Marcus walked through his old neighborhood, ending up at Rosa's corner store. Mrs. Rodriguez was training a new employee, a teenage girl who looked nervous about handling the register. Don't worry, Mija, Mrs. Rodriguez was saying. Everyone makes mistakes at first. The important thing is learning from them. She looked up and saw Marcus. Marcus, I just saw you on the news. Very impressive, talking to those politicians in Washington. Thanks, Mrs. Rodriguez. How's business? Good, good. And you know what's funny? Since your platform started getting attention, I've had 3 people from the neighborhood ask about starting their own small businesses. They want to know if I think they should join your community. What do you tell them? I tell them what? I told you 2 years ago, sometimes the best thing that happens to you is. The question was whether they could continue scaling impact while maintaining authenticity. Marcus pulled out his phone and sent a message to the team. Community meeting tomorrow. Time to discuss what we want our next chapter to look like. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, Marcus realized that the biggest test of Catalyst Collective wasn't whether it could succeed. They'd already proven that. The test was whether success would change them into something they didn't want to become. The irony wasn't lost on him. Having been excluded from traditional systems for not fitting in, they now faced the challenge of resisting pressure to fit into the mainstream success that wanted to claim them. But Marcus was confident they could navigate this challenge the same way they'd approached everything else, by staying true to their community, maintaining their commitment to authentic relationships, and continuing to prioritize collective success over individual achievement. The question wasn't whether Catalyst Collective would continue growing. The question was whether that growth would strengthen or compromise the values that had made their success meaningful in the first place. 5 years after Marcus Williams walked out of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions with a severance package and a shattered understanding of meritocracy, he stood before an audience of 1,200 people at the annual Catalyst Collective Summit in Chicago. The event had outgrown the convention center and moved to McCormick Place, but Marcus insisted on keeping the community-focused format that had defined their gatherings from the beginning. When we started Catalyst Collective, he began, his voice carrying easily through the packed auditorium, I thought we were building a better networking platform. What we actually built was a movement that proves excluded talent is undervalued talent. Today, this community has facilitated over $200 million in business transactions, created 15,000 jobs, and launched enterprises in every state and 12 countries. The applause was sustained. But Marcus knew the statistics, impressive as they weren't the real measure of their impact. But numbers don't tell the whole story, he continued. The real impact is in the relationships we've built, the systemic barriers we've challenged, and the alternative model of business success we've created together. In the 5 years since his exclusion from Pinnacle, Catalyst Collective had evolved far beyond Marcus's original vision. They now operated programs for veteran entrepreneurs, immigrant business owners, rural small business developers, and formerly incarcerated individuals starting enterprises. Each program was designed by and for the communities it served, following the participatory governance model that had made their original platform successful. Jasmine, now 23 and Catalyst Collective's chief operating officer, joined Marcus on stage for the opening presentation. Her journey from skeptical teenager to business leader exemplified the organization's approach to developing leadership from within their community. 5 years ago, I was a high school student who challenged Marcus during his first volunteer session at our community center. She told the audience, I asked him why we should listen to someone who'd just been fired from his fancy job. Today, I can answer that question, because sometimes the people who get pushed out of broken systems are the ones best positioned to build better systems. The Summit's program reflected Catalyst Collective's maturation as an organization. Workshops covered advanced topics like cooperative business structures, community-centered investment models, and policy advocacy strategies. But the focus remained on practical support for entrepreneurs who were building businesses aligned with their values rather than chasing market trends. During a break between sessions, Marcus was approached by James Patterson, his former colleague from Pinnacle who had taken over the Richardson Group presentation 5 years earlier. Marcus hadn't seen James since leaving the company, and his presence at the summit was unexpected. Marcus, James said, extending his hand. I wanted to congratulate you on what you've built here. It's remarkable. Marcus shook his hand, curious about what had brought James to the summit. Thanks for coming, James. Are you here professionally or personally? Both, actually. I left Pinnacle 2 years ago to start my own consulting firm. I've been following Catalyst Collective's growth and wanted to learn about your community-centered approach to business development. What made you leave Pinnacle? James looked uncomfortable. Honestly, I realized that the systems I was succeeding in weren't actually serving clients well. The Richardson Group presentation you developed, the one I delivered, was brilliant. But I knew I hadn't earned that success, and it never felt authentic. Marcus appreciated the honesty, though it came years too late to change anything meaningful about his experience at Pinnacle. What are you doing now? Marcus asked. I'm trying to build something more authentic, a consulting practice that actually serves diverse businesses rather than just talking about diversity. But I'm learning that you can't just change your business model, you have to change your understanding of what success means. Their conversation was interrupted by Carmen, who had been watching the interaction from across the hall. Marcus, we need you for the community governance panel in 10 minutes, she said, then turned to James with polite curiosity. Are you enjoying the summit? Very much. I'm particularly interested in your decision-making processes. Most businesses make strategic decisions at the executive level, but you're actually involving your community in governance. How does that work practically? Carmen smiled. It works because we built it into our structure from the beginning. When you start with the assumption that the people affected by decisions should have input into those decisions, you design systems that make that possible. The Community Governance Panel was one of the summit's most popular sessions, drawing entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, and academics interested in alternative organizational models. Marcus served as moderator while 5 Catalyst Collective members shared their experiences with participatory decision-making. Traditional business structures assume that efficiency requires hierarchy, explained Dr. Angela Rodriguez, who had become both an advisor and a case study subject as she'd applied Catalyst Collective principles to her work at Northwestern University. But we found that involving stakeholders in decision-making actually improves both efficiency and effectiveness because you make better decisions when you have more complete information. The key, added Rosa Gutierrez, whose cooperative lending circle had grown into a credit union serving 3 states, is designing processes that make participation meaningful rather than tokenistic. People can tell the difference between being asked for input and actually having influence over outcomes. Marcus found himself thinking about the contrast between this panel and the corporate presentations he'd given at Pinnacle. There, he'd spent his time trying to convince clients to trust his expertise. Here, he was facilitating conversations where community members shared expertise with each other. That afternoon's keynote speaker was Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a business school professor from UCLA who had been studying Catalyst Collective as part of her research on alternative economic models. What makes Catalyst Collective significant, Dr. Tanaka told the audience, isn't just that it serves underrepresented entrepreneurs effectively, it's that it demonstrates the viability of business models based on mutual support rather than competitive Advantage. This challenges fundamental assumptions about how markets work and what drives innovation. Her presentation included data comparing businesses launched through Catalyst Collective with those started through traditional entrepreneurship programs. The results were striking. Catalyst Collective businesses showed higher 5-year survival rates, stronger community engagement, and more sustainable growth patterns. These outcomes suggest that businesses built around authentic community connections and shared values may be more resilient than those focused purely on market capture, Dr. Tanaka concluded. During the summit's final session, Marcus participated in a panel discussion titled Exclusion as Innovation: Lessons from 5 Years of Alternative Business Building. The other panelists were entrepreneurs who had built successful enterprises after being pushed out of traditional systems. "The question I get asked most frequently," said Kevin Washington, whose platform Connecting Black Technologists now served 50,000 professionals globally, "is whether our success means the barriers we faced weren't really barriers. But that's backwards logic. Our success happened because we stopped trying to overcome barriers and started building roads around them." Exactly, added Maria Santos, whose fintech platform now processed over $100 million annually in loans to underrepresented small businesses. Traditional systems didn't fail to serve us by accident. They were designed to serve people who already had access to resources. When we stopped trying to fit into those systems and started building our own, we created something better. Marcus listened to his fellow panelists and reflected on how much his understanding of success had evolved. 5 years earlier, he'd measured achievement by external validation, salary, title, recognition from established institutions. Now he measured it by community impact, authentic relationships, and alignment between values and actions. Marcus, the moderator, asked, "What would you say to someone who's just experienced exclusion from a system they'd hoped to join?" Marcus paused, thinking about all the conversations he'd had with entrepreneurs who'd found their way to Catalyst Collective after facing rejection elsewhere. "I'd say that exclusion is information," he replied. "It tells you something important about the fit between who you are and what that system values. The question is whether you want to change yourself to fit the system or build something that aligns with who you actually are. And if someone chooses to build something new, then I'd tell them that the skills and perspective that got them excluded from the old system might be exactly what's needed to build a better one." Exclusion creates clarity about what doesn't work, and that clarity is the foundation for innovation. That evening, the summit concluded with a community celebration that reflected Catalyst Collective's emphasis on relationship building over traditional networking. Instead of formal receptions with name tags and elevator pitches, they organized collaborative activities where people worked together on real challenges facing their businesses and communities. Marcus moved through the gathering, observing conversations that would have been impossible at traditional business events. A veteran starting a construction company was getting advice from an immigrant entrepreneur who'd faced similar licensing challenges. A rural business owner was connecting with urban suppliers who shared her commitment to sustainable practices. A formerly incarcerated individual launching a food truck was learning about cooperative ownership models from a collective that had been operating successfully for 3 years. "Look what you built," Lisa Park said, joining Marcus as he watched the interactions around them. "Look what we built," Marcus corrected. "This doesn't happen because one person has a vision. It happens because a community decides to support each other's success." As the celebration wound down, Marcus found himself in conversation with a group of recent college graduates who were considering starting a business together. "We're trying to decide whether to apply for traditional startup accelerators or look for alternative approaches," one of them explained. "What would you recommend?" Marcus smiled, remembering his own certainty about what success looked like when he'd graduated from business school. "I'd recommend asking yourselves what you're optimizing for," he replied. "If you want to scale rapidly and attract venture capital, traditional accelerators might be the right path. But if you want to build something sustainable that aligns with your values and serves your community, you might want to consider alternatives." How do we know which path is right? Pay attention to who you become in each environment. The right path is the one where you can be authentic and effective simultaneously. Later that night, alone in his apartment, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him from corporate exclusion to community leadership. The path hadn't been linear or predictable, but it had been authentic in ways his corporate career never was. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Watched the live stream of your closing remarks. Your father would be proud of what you built, baby." Marcus smiled, thinking about his father saying that success without authenticity was just expensive failure. 5 years after his exclusion from Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, he finally understood what his father had meant. True success wasn't about getting included in someone else's system. It was about building something worth joining, not just for yourself, but for everyone who had been excluded from systems that were never designed to serve them in the first place. As Chicago's skyline sparkled outside his window, Marcus began planning for Catalyst Collective's next chapter. They'd proven that alternative business models could work. Now the question was how to scale that proof without losing the community-centered values that made it meaningful. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on him. Having been excluded for not fitting in, he now faced the challenge of maintaining his authentic vision while traditional systems wanted to embrace and potentially co-opt what he'd built. But Marcus felt confident about navigating this challenge. He'd learned that the key to authentic success wasn't avoiding difficult decisions, it was making those decisions based on community values rather than external pressures. The journey from exclusion to innovation was complete. The journey from innovation to lasting impact was just beginning. 7 years after Marcus Williams had been escorted out of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, he sat in the same Chicago coffee shop where he'd first met Lisa Park. But this time, he wasn't the one seeking guidance. He was meeting with David Kim, a 28-year-old marketing executive who had just been let go from his corporate job for reasons that sounded depressingly familiar. They said it was about cultural fit, David explained, his voice carrying the same confusion and anger Marcus remembered from his own experience. "I delivered great results, had excellent client relationships, but somehow I wasn't what they were looking for long-term." Marcus listened, seeing his younger self in David's wounded confidence and desperate need to make sense of what had happened to him. "The hardest part," David continued, "is that I really believed merit mattered. I thought if I worked hard enough, was smart enough, delivered results consistently, that would be sufficient. And now," Marcus asked gently, "now I don't know what to believe. If talent isn't enough, if results don't matter, then what does? How do you succeed in systems that seem designed to exclude you?" Marcus sipped his coffee, choosing his words carefully. "The question you're asking assumes that those systems are worth succeeding in. What if they're not?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if the problem isn't your ability to fit into their system, but the system itself? What if exclusion isn't a bug, but a feature designed to preserve existing power structures by making talented people feel like the problem is their inability to assimilate?" David looked skeptical. "So what's the alternative? Give up on professional success? Redefine professional success? Build something that aligns with your values rather than trying to conform to someone else's definition of achievement." Marcus went on to share his own story: the Richardson presentation, the conversation with Patricia Holmes, the months of unemployment and self-doubt, the discovery of authentic purpose through community service. 7 years ago, I thought being fired was the worst thing that could happen to my career," Marcus said. "Now I realize it was the best thing that could happen to my life." David was quiet for a long moment. "So you're saying I should be grateful for getting fired?" "I'm saying you should pay attention to what this experience is teaching you about the gap between what you were told success looked like and what success actually means for people like us." Their conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from the psychology of exclusion to alternative business models to the importance of authentic community connections. By the end, David seemed less devastated and more curious about possibilities he'd never considered. "There's something I want you to check out," Marcus said, handing David a card. "We're having a workshop next week for professionals who've experienced workplace exclusion. It's not a pity party, it's a strategy session for people who are ready to build something better." That evening, Marcus walked through downtown Chicago, past the Pinnacle Marketing Solutions building where his corporate career had ended. The building looked smaller than he remembered, less imposing. Through the windows, He could see people working late, pursuing the same kind of validation he'd once craved. Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions looking up at those lit windows, not regret exactly, but a kind of compassionate understanding for the person he'd been and the people still inside, trying to fit into systems that would never fully embrace them. His phone buzzed with a message from Jasmine. New milestone: 100,000 active members across 50 states and 25 countries. Community vote scheduled for Friday on the international expansion proposal. Marcus smiled. Catalyst Collective had grown beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd started writing blog posts about exclusion and authenticity. But more importantly, it had maintained its community-centered values even as it scaled globally. The expansion proposal Jasmine referenced was typical of how they approach growth, not through top-down strategic planning, but through community-driven decision-making that ensured new initiatives aligned with their founding principles. The next morning, Marcus arrived at Catalyst Collective's expanded headquarters in Bronzeville. They now occupied an entire building, but the space maintained the community center aesthetic that reflected their values: comfortable seating areas for informal conversations, collaborative workspaces, walls covered with photos and stories from community members. Morning, Marcus called out Carmen, who now served as Catalyst Collective's executive director. Ready for the board meeting? The board meeting was another example of how they'd innovated on traditional business structures. Instead of a typical corporate board focused on financial performance, Catalyst Collective's board included community representatives, partner organization leaders, and entrepreneurs who'd been served by their programs. First agenda item, Carmen began as the group settled around their conference table, is the impact report for the third quarter. The numbers were impressive. 15,000 new businesses launched through their platform in the past year, 85% of which were still operating after 3 years, significantly higher than national averages for small business survival. But the board was equally interested in qualitative measures: community engagement levels, member satisfaction surveys, and stories of transformation that couldn't be captured in spreadsheets. What strikes me about these numbers, observed Dr. Rodriguez, who now chaired their board, is how they demonstrate that businesses built around authentic community connections are more resilient than those focused purely on market capture. That's consistent with what we're seeing in our research partnerships, added Dr. Tanaka, who participated remotely from UCLA. Universities across the country are studying Catalyst Collective's model as an alternative to traditional entrepreneurship support programs. The board meeting continued with discussions about policy advocacy, partnership opportunities, and the community vote on international expansion. But Marcus found himself thinking about David Kim, the young marketing executive he'd met the day before, and the thousands of other talented professionals who were experiencing exclusion at that very moment. I want to add an agenda item, Marcus said during the meeting's final minutes. I think we need to expand our support for professionals who are transitioning out of corporate environments after experiencing exclusion. What are you thinking? Carmen asked. A more structured program, workshops, mentorship, matching, resource sharing specifically designed for people who are ready to redefine success but need support making the transition. Jasmine leaned forward. That's interesting. We get inquiries like that constantly, but we've been handling them case by case. A structured program could serve more people more effectively, and it addresses a gap in our offerings, added Rosa Gutierrez, who participated in board meetings as a community representative. We serve entrepreneurs well once they've decided to start businesses, but we could do more to support people who are still figuring out what authentic success means for them. The board approved development of what they decided to call the Transition Leadership Program, a 6-month initiative for professionals who wanted to align their careers with their values rather than external expectations. After the meeting, Marcus walked to the community center where he'd first volunteered 7 years earlier. The youth entrepreneurship program was still operating, now led by several of his former students who'd gone on to start successful businesses and wanted to give back to the next generation. Mr. Williams called out a teenager Marcus didn't recognize. Are you the guy who started Catalyst Collective? I'm one of the people who started it, Marcus replied, emphasizing the collaborative nature of their work. Are you interested in entrepreneurship? Maybe. My cousin uses your platform for her catering business and says it's different from other business programs. She says it actually helps people instead of just talking about helping them. Marcus smiled. What makes you think about starting a business? I want to solve problems in my community, but I don't want to become fake corporate like some people who make it. My cousin says your program teaches people how to be successful without losing themselves. The conversation reminded Marcus of his first session with the Youth Entrepreneurship Program, when Jasmine had challenged him about why they should listen to someone who'd just been fired. 7 years later, that teenage skeptic was running operations for an organization that had helped thousands of people build authentic, successful careers. That evening, Marcus had dinner with his mother at their weekly tradition. At 68, Denise Williams remained sharp and observant, though she'd finally retired from nursing after 4 decades of service. You seem thoughtful tonight, she observed as they shared a meal of her famous baked chicken and collard greens. I've been thinking about cycles, Marcus replied. 7 years ago, I was the one who needed help figuring out what to do after being excluded from a system that wasn't right for me. Now I'm in a position to help other people navigate similar transitions. That's the best kind of success, his mother said. When your healing becomes other people's healing, Marcus nodded, thinking about his father saying about success without authenticity being expensive failure. 7 years of building Catalyst Collective had taught him that authentic success wasn't just about individual achievement, it was about creating conditions for other people's authentic success too. You know what's funny, Mom? When I got fired from Pinnacle, I thought it was the end of everything I'd worked for. But it was actually the beginning of work that actually mattered. Denise smiled. Your father used to say that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is not getting what you thought you wanted. Makes room for what you actually needed. Later that night, Marcus sat in his apartment working on notes for the Transition Leadership Program. He thought about all the David Kims out there, talented professionals who'd been told that their exclusion was their fault, that they needed to try harder to fit into systems that were never designed to include them. His phone rang with a call from Lisa Park, who was now a close friend and trusted advisor. I saw the board minutes, she said. The Transition Leadership Program sounds like a natural evolution of your work. It feels like completing a circle, Marcus replied. 7 years ago, I needed someone to help me understand that exclusion could be redirection rather than rejection. Now I want to be that person for others. What's different about your approach compared to traditional career transition programs? Marcus thought about the question. Traditional programs assume that the goal is finding a better fit within existing systems. Our program starts with the assumption that the person isn't broken, the system is. We help people build alternatives, rather than trying harder to assimilate. That's a fundamental shift in perspective. It's the shift that changed my life. Instead of asking how can I fit into their system, I learned to ask what system should I build. That question opens up possibilities that conformity closes off. As their call ended, Marcus reflected on the journey from exclusion to innovation to impact. The path hadn't been linear or predictable, but it had been authentic in ways his corporate career never could have been. He opened his laptop and began writing a blog post titled 7 Years Later. What I learned about success, authenticity, and the power of building your own path. It was a reflection on the journey from Pinnacle Marketing Solutions to Catalyst Collective, but also a letter to everyone who was currently experiencing the kind of exclusion that had once devastated him. 7 years ago, he wrote, I thought being excluded meant I had failed. Today, I understand that exclusion was information data about the mismatch between who I was and what that system valued. The question wasn't how to change myself to fit their system, but whether to build something that aligned with my actual values and served people who'd been similarly excluded. Marcus wrote through the night, pouring 7 years of hard-won wisdom into words he hoped would help someone else navigate their own journey from exclusion to authentic success. When he finally stopped writing, the Chicago dawn was breaking over the city where his transformation had begun. Looking out at the skyline, Marcus realized that his story wasn't really about overcoming exclusion, it was about discovering that Being pushed out of the wrong system had freed him to build something better. The exclusion that had felt like an ending had actually been a beginning, not just for him, but for the thousands of people who'd found community, support, and authentic success through the platform he'd helped create, the boy who'd grown up on the South Side believing that success meant convincing gatekeepers to let him in had become a man who built systems worth joining. The professional who'd been excluded for not fitting in had created a community where belonging was the starting point, not the goal. 7 years after walking out of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions with a severance package and a shattered understanding of meritocracy, Marcus Williams had built something more valuable than any corporate career could have provided: a life and a business that aligned with his authentic values, served his community, and proved that excluded talent was just undervalued. Talent waiting for the right opportunity to thrive. The journey from exclusion to innovation was complete. The journey from innovation to lasting legacy was just beginning. And Marcus had never been more excited about what came next. The end. Before I was excluded, I thought it was the end. After that, I changed everything. A story about how being pushed out of the wrong system can free you to build the right one.